Okay, welcome to Nail Worship Test Episode 2 with me, Joshua Hardesty, and
Jason Gillis.
Today, we are talking about the Lincoln 7-inch. And Lincoln is a sort of legendary emo band, but that's largely off of the material that came after this. They put out a split 7-inch with Hoover in 1994. I think that's the thing that really got them on people's radar as an emo band. And then they put out a posthumous 7-inch with 2 more songs from that same session in 95. But that's not the record we're talking about today. We're talking about the Union 7-inch on Watermark Records today.
Quick question. Did the second 7-inch also come out on Watermark?
No, the split and the second 7-inch both came out on Art Monk Construction.
Right. Okay. And that's a distinction.
I think you're right. It's a significant distinction. And I think it's going to be hard for us not to constantly go and reference the Art Monk stuff.
Yeah.
Because of how much it changed whatever associations there were with this band.
Yeah, and I think an introduction to them, I think that's a pretty apt one. My recollection, however, is that this 7-inch was the thing that knocked everybody's heads off.
Let's give a little bit more background to this. So Lincoln was a hardcore band from Morgantown, West Virginia. And the members were on vocals, Jay Demko, who would later play guitar in Lincoln as well, and then go on to form the bands Glendale, Koo Kim, and some other stuff. Guitar was John Herod. Bass was Joanna Clayson, who would leave the band before the other material would come out. And then on drums, Justin Werbonsky. Let's get into our general appreciation of this record. I think the thing so this is the second time we're talking about this record. The first time the recording sucked. One thing that we both came away from in revisiting this record was this actually might be my favorite thing by them. Not the stuff that cemented them as being super important to the later kind of pop emo sound, but actually like this thing is insanely good.
Yeah, I wanted to make one more distinction before we dive into this. Is I think a piece of information you told me, which I wasn't aware of, was that Jay Demko doesn't play guitar on this, correct?
Yes, and I think that was a surprise to both of us. We found that out right before we recorded the other one. It was always our assumption that he played guitar and sang. We got in touch with Jay Demko on Instagram, and he confirmed that he didn't play guitar in this, and he didn't write any of the guitar. And I think
it's really surprising to me, I guess. That's all. Because there is a through line, I think, between the two records. But, I guess I just with Joanna on bass for this and not the other one, and him not writing any of the guitar parts and not playing guitar. Oh, and it being on Watermark versus Art Monk. It doesn't make it a different band per se, but it definitely makes it like sort of on par with like Dag Nasty before and after Sean Brown or something. There's just like a whole, like it's the same band, but it's different. And I think that's really cool. This record is my favorite, I think, out of their small catalog. It's an incredible record. It's now and then. It's like remarkable now still. It still sounds ahead of its time.
The one little anecdote that I will put in is the way that we picked this record for the episode is we wanted to do just something we thought was interesting. And I just started flipping through a stack of 7-inches and was like, oh, what about the Lincoln 7-inches? I know that I haven't listened to this record since like 1994. And when I opened it in YouTube, and as soon as it started, I was like, oh, this is that record. It all like came back as like, oh, this record's incredible. And I realized that I've never forgotten about this record. It wasn't like one of those things where you're like surprised and then you remember that you liked it. It was like, oh yeah, this song is routinely still stuck in my head, even though I haven't listened to the actual record in 20 years or something like that.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I think I always held this band and those records and related, like Glendale, in a really high regard, even though I kind of forgot about them or something. I think that it stands out of time with what was happening in hardcore, to put it really generally. It's interesting that the last episode we were talking about Carp. I think it's a coincidence or something, but it has similar qualities. Like it feels like just like a future vision of like it is a hardcore record, and it's very 93. Like it's got a heavy nature to it that wasn't surprising on one hand, but the way they wrote and arranged the songs and put everything together, it's completely brilliant. One comment on the YouTube, when I was reviewing it on YouTube, because my physical copy's in storage, I think somebody dubbed it compassionate chugging. and I'm listening, I'm like, this totally is. It has a sincerity to it that is unlike a lot of the bands at the time. It's an amazing record, I think.
What's fascinating about it is that for me, it came on the scene the same day as the Earth Crisis Firestorm 7-inch, a record that is completely significant. And I think this record is probably lost to history by virtue of the fact that they changed their sound and then they broke up prematurely in terms of the ability to spread what they were doing, and they never released an LP, like all of that stuff. But I think all of that stuff means that this record is sort of obscure because they changed their sound. This really is Lincoln 1.0. And then later, within a year, they'd basically be like 2.0. So both of those records, I heard them the same day. They were brand new. They were both on important hardcore labels like Firestorm 7-inch being on Victory, this being on Watermark. Watermark was like a really new label, but they had come out the gates swinging in terms of they'd already put out records by Worlds Collide, Encounter, which was like people from Encounter owned the label. They probably had already put out a Flagman 7-inch, which the 7-inch sucks, but Flagman were an important band. So they already had like this different vision of hardcore, but it was rooted in the hardcore scene. It wasn't like it wasn't a scene that was like foreign to the mainstream of hardcore at the time, if that makes sense. So this is like my recollection of it, was that it was heavy. It was chugging, but then it was melodic, and it wasn't melodic in the way that the other Watermark type stuff or maybe like some Revelation stuff was. The vocals almost have a pop punk sensibility to them. Like they're a little bit bratty and they're screamed and sung at the same time, but then it's really heavy. And I think if you hear the version that's on YouTube or you listen to the vinyl versus if you listen to the newly mixed and mastered stuff that's on the discography LP, where it's been leveled out to sit comfortably with the Lincoln 2.0 material, this version of it is very heavy. It sounds like a hardcore record, but it sounds unlike any hardcore record you've ever heard.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. The vocals and the sort of switch ups, like in Stop Means Stop and stuff, where it goes from like this punishing, super heavy, like chugging, to like a turnaround to like sort of like a poppy refrain is so interesting. But yeah, I agree. It sounds like whoever was writing was probably listening to like Crimp Shrine or something, as well as like, I don't know, Slayer or something. I don't know where the heavy influence comes from them. It's kind of hard to identify. I like about it. is that it approximates what was happening in 93 in hardcore. Like what they're doing is the same, like it's a good parallel to the Earth Crisis 7-inch, because those heavy parts are doing the same thing. They're just coming from an extremely different place musically to some extent, because these guys were, I think, more DC oriented, even with the heavy stuff, but also just like, emotionally, I think, obviously Earth Crisis, it's all about the environment and veganism and stuff, and more overtly political. I love the just the mashup of it. And I think what you just said about the production, original production versus the J. Robbins remix and remaster, I think they're both good, but I tend to agree with what I think you're saying, which is the original production of it is somehow, I don't know if I could say better. I think I prefer it, though. It's really crunchy. It's so good. I like the way the vocals are mixed, too, on that versus the remix.
I think when you hear the discography and you read some of the reviews of it, people can be forgiven for thinking it was a band with a diverse sound and not a band that changed from one side of that record to the other. That record works well as an LP in that the two sides are made to work together. But the reality is that this was a hardcore record on a hardcore label, recorded at the same studio where Encounter, Lifetime, Resurrection, a lot of hardcore records of the time were recorded. And it sounds
what
like...
What studio was that record?
It was called SRA, which basically, I believe, stood for Seth R. Alexander.
I wonder if it was like a lo-fi kind of deal, like somebody's home studio, or... I
think it was a home studio, and basically all that New Jersey stuff that was on New Age at the time were recorded there.
What were the name of the guys that ran Watermark? Jordan Brothers? It was two brothers, right?
Joel and Jason Jordan.
They probably sent them there, I would imagine. Or there might have been some kind of agreement. Thinking along the lines of running a label, and Watermark was kind of a brand of a label, the way like New Age was at the time too. It was probably a strong suggestion from them to go there.
I think so too. And we talked about this. This band was so mysterious in a way. They came out of nowhere. They were based in West Virginia. They did tour, but I don't know anyone that saw them in the Northeast.
Me either.
But here was my initial assumption of how this band functioned. They made this record, and they had a very strange sensibility, which is that they were clearly into hardcore, but it was being corrupted by something else, by like Jawbox or DC stuff. And then that through the lineup changes into that second. I mean, I honestly thought that what happened was they sounded like this. They played with Hoover. They sounded like for Lincoln 2.0 afterwards. And when we were doing research for this episode, we sort of saw there was like a much different trajectory, that everyone in this band was in a band called Ice Fan from 88 to 91. And Ice Fan were a melodic punk hardcore band, but like a melodic one, like a late 80s DC or SST type of thing. And they were all right. I'm not listening to Ice Fan anytime soon.
The following audio is the song Don't Limit Yourself from the Ice Fan demo.
And then they switch things up. John Herod plays guitar, Joanna Klassen plays bass, and they turn into Lincoln, and now they're a hardcore band. And I think some of the influence there potentially is that one of the members of Encounter had moved to Morgantown, West Virginia for college. And I think he brought maybe that New Jersey mainstream hardcore influence to their circle. So rather than being hardcore kids who were like discovered melodic stuff, I think they were more like these melodic punk kids. Like that was their aesthetic, who then discovered hardcore, but maybe didn't quite get it. And as you pointed out, they were listening to Godflesh and stuff like that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know that bit of info just from Greg Foreman, who was the Delta 72 and Samuel and all that. No, not Samuel, Junction.
And he had a band with these guys.
Yeah, called Manhandle. So I think the thing is with people now with Wikipedia and the internet is everything's categorized. And there was a period of time, the early 90s was very much like sort of like, or I think of it at least, like as a pluralistic kind of like, we weren't thinking this was post-hardcore, but the bands like Supertouch and Burn and these more sort of progressive ends of hardcore that were kind of coming up, or make Quicksand is another one. To hardcore kids like that were doing bands like Encounter, and I mean I think Flagman was trying to do some kind of, they were sort of like Supertouch in a weird way. I'm trying to mentally put myself in the position of being somebody who's like, hindsight being what it is. It's easy to be snobby and be like, oh, these like goofy Pennsylvania straight edge bands like Encounter. I don't think that, but I just mean like from the perspective of a college student or young person in a band called Ice Fan that's kind of maybe more into Soul Side and like Dag Nasty or something, being actually open to that stuff. But you have to remember, like, there were interviews at the time where Ian MacKaye was like talking about like, oh yeah, this band's Supertouch, they were pretty good, you know, like there was things were a lot more open back then. This was the period of time I got into hardcore around 91, I guess. There was just a lot of crossover, you know. I think straight edge kids, that stuff could meld. And I think people are going to a lot of different kinds of shows and stuff anyway, like alt rock stuff too. And, you know, whatever you want to call it. But I think that's an interesting cross between the two.
There's that. And then there's another interesting thing, which is that what you were capable of at the time depended on your access to records. If your friend group is only into certain strains of music or punk, which I think you and I have had the same experience of stuff we disregarded because we didn't know people that listened to it. So we had weird associations with, oh, that band's like this, you know, or that band's like whatever, drug music or whatever it might be. It depends on the scene that you're in, right? I'm sure a lot of people didn't listen to cool straight edge bands because they were part of a straight edge scene and they were into not straight edge stuff, right? Whereas like for me, I ignored a lot of stuff because it didn't fit within the mold of the straight edge scene or later the emo scene. So for these,
yeah, it eventually got that way for me as well.
And so for these kids in West Virginia making music that's probably defined by the records they have access to, and then if they get introduced to something new and they're like, whoa, this is it, right? Like you hear Godflesh and then all of a sudden you're like, that's amazing. Or you see maybe videos of like those Northeastern straight edge hardcore bands where the shows are exciting. And part of what makes them exciting is that the singer is holding a microphone and is in the crowd with the audience. The audience is on stage with the band, something that is never going to happen with Jawbox. You know what I mean? It's so important, the idea of records being in your vicinity or tapes of them for shaping what you realize is possible. And then the beauty of it is maybe how it's warped by your sensibilities. Like Lincoln was a group of kids who'd been playing together for years before the 7-inch comes out. And then if they get super into hardcore for a while, that mutates what it is because maybe they're not, and, you know, and I'm conjecturing, right? Because for all I know, Morgantown has a rich straight edge hardcore scene. Yeah. But to me, it sounds so warped that it sounds like a sudden influx of something new into already a group of individuals who had tastes and craft.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's funny. It almost seems regressive now that we're talking about it, though, because it usually goes in the other direction. Like hardcore bands maturing into like to a certain extent, even Dinosaur Jr. have their roots in hardcore. And I mean, I gotta listen to the Ice Fan demo actually, but I'm understanding what you're saying about what the influences were, and then this other thing coming in, and it makes me think that they were able to do it without it being super overt, because I think they could draw from those influences. Like I'm thinking the heaviness on this Lincoln 7-inch, it does kind of come from like records like Godflesh, like those riffs, like where it just turns down and it's just like pummeling, like it.
Godflesh, like Rats, from the 1989 album Street Cleaner.
it does seem to be coming from the metal world more than hardcore. But that's, I think, the importance of the arrival of this release, as well as Firestorm, and the development of hardcore and metal to a certain extent, and whatever lies in between, was that innovation. Like the same way, like Earth Crisis, when you listen to it now, not to talk about them too much, but like when you listen to that first 7-inch now, I kind of understand now when my uncle then, who's a musician, heard it and goes, oh, this kind of reminds me of Black Sabbath. I thought he was crazy. And now I listen to him like, that's what the root of Earth Crisis is, essentially those kinds of riffs. That was incredibly innovative for them. And to speak to this 7-inch, the heaviness was probably coming from the fact that these guys were listening to outside of the box quite a bit. And I was surprised when Greg told me about this. I feel kind of goofy. I wore a Godflesh hoodie today, not because of this. But I was surprised when he mentioned that. Not that surprised, because I got into Godflesh. I bought Street Cleaner, I think in the early 90s too. It seemed like deep cut metal related stuff to me. Not to really focus on them, but just to illustrate what I know of Greg, what he's told me, which is nothing too detailed about these people in Lincoln. I think they had a wide swath of influences and got real bored with hardcore pretty much after this.
I don't remember how we found out about that Manhandle 7-inch, but me and my circle of friends have found out about it. And finally I found one in like Amherst, Massachusetts, like randomly, and was like, oh my God, I got it. And then I listened to it and wasn't into it. I have not listened to it again since probably circa 95. But what I recall about it is that it was very sludgy. And, I was listening to like in terms of metal leaning stuff, it was like Unbroken, Life, Love, Regret, that Converge first LP maybe, which is obviously a very eclectic and pluralistic record in of itself, but the metal parts are very much that South of Heaven riff stealing type stuff. And that was like the heavy stuff that I listened to. Like stuff like Starkweather was too much. It was too metal, right? So then this record, it didn't sound like the Slayer type stuff. And now it occurs to me, it probably sounds like sludge stoner metal, if I had to guess, based on my recollections. And I think that speaks to that sort of warped thing that happens on this record, which is that it's delivered to you under the guise of Watermark. It's heavy as hell. It's catchy as hell. It's so different. And then you hear these other things about them. You start to piece together, like, the influences are so unexpected from the label. That's maybe the thing, right? Coming in on Watermark with label mates like Flagman and Encounter or One or whatever, but then the influences on it are actually from totally different scenes.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm thinking of now too is, I think with Lincoln and just all projects Jay Demko, at least the ones I know of. I mean, I think there were influences, and we're trying to decode them a bit. But I think that Lincoln in this record is like 20% influence and 80% just pure like voice and vision, like I don't want to call him a visionary, but there is some like, and I don't want to give him all the credit because he didn't even write like these guitar parts and stuff. I'll just give it to the band, but there was something absolutely like, I don't want to use this word too loosely, but brilliant about what the hell was going on there. Like it really does. Like, I think we talked about Jawbox on the first take of this record, and in a lot of ways it does feel like a super crunchy take on that kind of, because if you listen to the first Jawbox record, my point is, I think that the brilliance of records like this, I mean, you could say, there's a category of like just brilliant sort of like shooting star releases. Like I'm dialing all the way back with like punk, like the first Buzzcock 7-inch, or like the Sex, some people say the Sex Pistols LP. Like, I don't think that's one, but the really like wow records through punk and hardcore and through the underground, I think usually come from some sort of absorption of influence, but then reformulated through just, I don't even want to call it talent. It seems more like vision. And with like bands like Lincoln, it is talent, because man, that rhythm section is incredible.
And maybe this record is so good and so singular that it forces you to ask all these other questions of, where the hell did this come from? Like that's almost why we're having so much discussion about Godflesh and Discord and whatever, because it ultimately is like, where the hell did this thing come from?
I feel like I have a sense of it. But then I think the thing that's more confounding to me now is, where did it go? Like, I can't believe that this wasn't bigger than it was. I can't believe that it didn't. I mean, I think in a way it probably did influence bands like this first 7-inch, like Botch or Coalesce or like any of that sort of, in a weird way, even Converge to a certain extent. Like, I think that this did have an impact. However, there was never a Lincoln copycat band that I can think of. Like, I don't think anyone... Because I don't think you can copy this stuff, basically. Like that, the record's so oddball, has so many weird turnarounds, from going from like down tune heavy, chop your head off, chugging riffs to like upbeat, poppy, like Lookout record style, like just for like one measure. That's why I'm trying to make the point about the influence. I don't think they were deriving too much. Like, I think they really like absorbed their influences and turned around, and that came out.
And song wise, the thing that I remember thinking about, because you know, sometimes you remember a record, like here's to me, like the classic one I think of is the Union of Uranus split 7-inch. That record starts, and for, I don't know, 90 seconds or less, it's the best thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
Union of Uranus. Believing. 1994.
It is still one of my favorite guitar riffs of all time. And then the song goes on for 6 minutes. And by the end of it, I want, like, you know how like they used to do like disco edits of records, like bootleg disco edits, either shortening or lengthening them. I want a disco edit of that record cut down to a lean 2.5 minutes.
Well, it's sample it and make something out of it.
Right?
Just make something out of it.
This record, every single song is exactly as long as it needs to be. Nothing outstays its welcome. No chorus shows up too many times or too few times. Everything hits, makes an impact, and then goes away when it should go away.
Yeah, they were really talented. They knew what the fuck they were doing. I think they proved that on the second 7-inch too, even more so maybe. But like the Rye Carp split that we already covered, and like most remarkable records, the art direction and the design, it in and of itself is well executed. Well, it's pretty dated looking in a way, but it's also, I think, a really nice piece of design and creative direction. You know, in a weird way, somebody could look at the cover and go, this looks like a cheesy hardcore, or actually it looks like a goth record. It looks like a Christian death record, let's be honest. Like, it's kind of mysterious, but I've always thought it was a really beautiful looking record. And I think actually all the Watermark stuff, to their credit, always look good. Even that bad Flagman 7-inch, I don't necessarily love the photo, but it's just, these releases were all pretty impressive, and the Lincoln one was sort of one of the most impressive, I think. Was it colored vinyl too? Was that?
My copy is green, so mine's numbered 315 out of 800. I don't know if that's the whole first pressing, or if that's, for example, the green pressing.
Well, you know what it is? They probably pressed 1,000 and did like 800 in green, and
and it's thick for the time period, frankly. Like it's a semi-transparent green, but it almost feels like 180 gram vinyl.
It's a really nice record, and I love that cover, and even like the typeface they use. You'd know what that is, not me.
The typeface is copper plate. So that's an interesting thing too, because I like, you know, Jay Robbins designed records in the early days of Jawbox. Like, he designed some of the Jawbox records, and he designed some records for other people, and he would use a lot of stretched out copper plate, and that's what's on this record. One thing that's interesting is they did know that this looked good enough to reference it for the second Lincoln 7-inch, the Sugarloaf Waterboy on Art Monk Construction. They didn't do exactly the same. They used like a slightly heavier weight, and they didn't stretch it as much. They made it the exact same placement. They were clearly looking for that continuity between the two things. And you're right. The other thing about it that's interesting is that the lyric sheet looks very abolition, but it's more stylish. It's got that like justified blocks of type in a clean typeface, super moody photographs, printed one color. It's not as extreme as an abolition release, but it seems more abolition-y than, say, New Age.
But that's what I could appreciate about Watermark at the time, too. I mean, and I just think in general, Watermark was doing things in a really cool way. We have to stop pretty soon, but, that's a whole other conversation, I think, about the typography of some of, maybe not Watermark specifically, but of some of these releases and the design, because again, while some of these ideas seem really dated, like the hyper justified text and even like the big no-no of stretching text and stuff, I've come back around because I'm guilty of it. I don't have a copy of my fanzine from high school, but I was doing a lot of that stuff in my early design endeavors. And I've come back around to kind of reappreciating it for what it is when it works. Or maybe I just have a nostalgic positive association with certain things like the Lincoln 7-inch.
I do it now. Like this mug, I'm like drinking from a Halifax mug that has stretched, heavily spaced out Futura on the mug. And then actually the design is a ripoff of a Jawbox 7-inch with more stretched Futura. And it's sort of a ripoff of Unsane Records as well.
Right. I mean, I think it looks really good in certain instances, and it seems to be something that was like utilized a lot. It wasn't just hardcore, it's just
a lot of like scuzzy 90s music had a similar typographic sense,
and I like it a lot. I don't know, I think it went out of fashion. I don't want to tear off into a
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
I don't want to tear off into a design combo, but from your perspective, you know a hell of a lot more than I do about design. Was that sort of concurrent with Ray Gun and David Carson, or was that something that just was influenced by that? Or
that's a good question, because I'm trying to think. He didn't really do that as much, but he did do the thing of showing the freedom of what could be done with computers
and with type, like with breaking all the rules and stuff.
Yeah, but now that I think about it, if you take, say, Trans World Skateboarding, which was done pre-computer, he was doing some wild typographic stuff because of photocopiers and photostat cameras. To reproduce your type or to blow it up, you'd use like a camera, basically, and you could warp that. Ed Fellow would do it as well. But I think a lot of it is maybe just from untrained people having access to computers and then that establishing a look.
That was definitely the case, to bring it back around to the Lincoln thing and hardcore. I think that was definitely the case with us. I don't mean me and you specifically, but I do in a way. But everybody, the whole fanzine culture, I think seemed to be a lot of design, I don't want to say innovations, just ideas happening, being born of kind of untrained people having access to PageMaker.
Well, yeah, think about now that I think about it, because he may have been an art school design student at the time, but the Converge Halo in a Haystack 12-inch has insane stretch type everywhere, right? That's a good example, though, not to diverge too far into this, but thinking about that record versus Relapse or someone just did a reissue of Caven's record that Jake also designed. And that one's, I don't want to say it's heavily David Carson influenced.
Oh, it is. Yeah, no, it is.
Because at that point, David Carson had completely changed the state of graphic design to where you couldn't see anything that wasn't David Carson designed.
Yeah, I don't think people were aware that they were being influenced by it at a certain point in the 90s. Like Jake he's smart enough about art and design that he might have been aware of it, but I think it was in the air. And I used to read Ray Gun just because it looked cool. Like you would just pick up ideas from, I mean, you're right though, to make that connection, because the design of that record, we could do a different podcast about the design of these records, but that does look very Carson, actually, the way they did the logo and stuff.
Yeah. The deconstructed, copied and pasted type, which if we were another generation of cranky designers. We could be angry that really it's CalArts influenced or Cranbrook influenced or whatever, some of those grad schools at the time. But yeah, it's got that what would be called like deconstructionist vibe. Whereas that Converge record we were just discussing, it's odd. It's because it's like an artful expression, but it does feel like it belongs in the world of hardcore at that time. Now, I don't think you'd say that, other than if you were to knock it off because you were paying reference to it, you might say like, oh, this looks like a hardcore record. But I think at the time it was an interesting looking record because he had such a delicate touch. It wasn't the way Jay Robbins would take like the giant fat Futura and stretch it. Oh, like the final Jawbox LP where 6 letters stretch top to bottom across the album.
Oh yeah, I like that.
I forgot about
the other one I was looking at because I've been like looking at a lot of Sub Pop stuff, but I was just looking at covers in their catalog, just checking out design. And there's I think a band, The Fluid, same thing, like super stretched text. And I know we're taught not to do that, but I don't really know why. I do know why, but at the same time, I like it, maybe for nostalgic purposes to a certain extent.
Well, it's interesting because it does define the aesthetics outside of the accepted parameters of the mainstream of the design world. Kind of like how we go through phases where ultra Helvetica oriented modernist stuff looks insanely punk rock. Even though it basically just looks like a slicker version of something from 1968. God, this is going to be my last tangent, but somebody posted a Snapcase LP, whenever it came out, I wasn't into Snapcase, but it's super black and white Helvetica, like fat weights of Helvetica, overabundance of information about the record. It's like a Victory Records thing from like 1999 or maybe later, but it looks so much like something by Designers Republic that I had to check and make sure it wasn't actually by Designers Republic, but it wasn't. It was like somebody who designed shit for Victory Records ripping off Designers Republic. But I was thinking about how shocking it would have looked in the context of hardcore at the time and the context of the mainstream, because the mainstream was like, if you remember, like, well, a big chunk of the 90s, like a Taco Bell tray label, like the tray insert, it looked avant-garde, sticking more like the ray gun, emigre type aesthetic. So then that Designers Republic stuff looked insanely radical, even though it was just 60s Swiss stuff on steroids. And then you transport that overseas, and then all of a sudden everything is clean in Helvetica for a while. And then, and something else like has to disrupt whatever the status quo is. And I think stretching the type was a pretty easy way of, for a while, delineating this didn't come from the established world of graphic designers and their institutions.
It also seemed like a way, from my perspective, doing it at the time to dress up otherwise less exciting looking type, like the stretched copper plate for Lincoln. I think that's a nice typeface, honestly. But
it doesn't have the versatility to really call it a display typeface.
Display is what I'm thinking. Yeah, sorry.
Because it's squat. It doesn't have as much sort of natural gestalt. But you just brought up something really important too that we completely take for granted, which is that fonts cost money.
Mm-hmm.
And so
more so back then.
Yeah, Copperplate was a system font. A lot of those records were stretching like Arial, not even or Gil Sans. They were stretching system fonts. It's like basically having a shitty photo and being like, okay, what can I do with this photo to make it interesting? Well, what if I photocopy it instead of just scanning it, and then the photocopy adds some texture?
Yeah, I mean, people, including myself, forget what limited access. I mean, now we can go get anything, font-wise, typeface-wise, like everything now. But in 30 years ago, not to sound like a dinosaur, but I don't even know how it worked. How would you even get font libraries? I'd imagine you have to order them on disc or something.
You had to send a check or a money order to a font company and get a disc or later like a CD-ROM, or you could spend like $1,400 and get a library of fonts on a CD. Later, there was like that whole sort of free font movement that eventually happened. Right. But if you think about,
we needed the internet for that though. Like we kind of needed the late 90s to come around before that to start to happen, I would think.
I hadn't thought about that, but if you think about making one of these records and like, let's say you didn't have your own computer set up, you probably went to a school with a computer lab, you're dependent on whatever fonts that they have. If you're Kent McClard, you don't dress it up at all. You just run with it. But if you're more artistically leaning, like maybe Jay Robbins or those like Syracuse guys that were doing like those like Guav and those guys doing those zines and those flyers up in like Syracuse, you're figuring out like, I'll take Olive Antiqua or whatever the hell it's called. I'll make it huge. I'll compress it and I'll put an outline on it. Man, it will be like a thing.
Syracuse was like the king of type stretching, those guys, like those flyers. And I think they're iconic and great looking. Yeah. I mean, well, those guys must have had better access because I know that John McCaig was like kind of the older mentor type guy, but he was like a professor at the university there or something. Wasn't he like a teacher?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I think he was
a printmaking teacher or something like that.
The school probably had like better font libraries and stuff. But just to speak to this typographic nature of like the Lincoln or any of the stuff, it is interesting. And I don't think a lot of us consider this too much. Those limitations did greatly influence how these things were made. The way these graphic identities of certain labels like Watermark and some of the better ones like Equal Vision would be another one. Just the making of these things design-wise is pretty interesting. Because if you dial it back, like just in 10 years prior to like SST and Discord and stuff, things were still relying on a lot of cut and paste and letraset, which is relate back to the Rye Carp split. They just went there. In any case, it's fascinating. And I think that the stretching the type, I just wanted to say one other thing about Syracuse and that is that I thought then and now that shit looked hot. Like it was cool.
Me too.
I thought that shit looked really great.
I think that stuff looks still cool today.
That stuff's influenced me. Like I remember years ago when I was doing like more flyers and stuff myself. I think it was influential on those of us that went on to do varying degrees of design as adults. I never became a designer, but I've done a lot of design and I don't even think I think about how much 90s hardcore informed some of the things I do.
I think the one thing that I would add too is that with this Lincoln 7-inch, looking at the sleeve right now, I think that if I had to, like if I had a group of students, I could break down why I think this cover is good in a way that would go beyond nostalgia. Now, sometimes you have a thing and you're like, I love this, but it's purely the nostalgia factor. But this thing, there's stuff going on here where I could be like, I could talk about the color, I could talk about the photography, I could talk about even what they're doing on the back cover with the typography about why I think it works. No, there's not a lot of records I might really be able to say like a justification of this artwork. A lot of times I would just be like, oh, I like this because it's of the time. This is of the time, but I actually think that you're correct. And like you're saying, like it looks really good and it still looks really good. There's a couple little gestures where I'd be like, okay, that's overly dated.
I think I'm with you. I could make a case for that being a well-designed, well-presented record. I love that cover. It's really beautiful. And I think the fact that it doesn't look like a hardcore record at all, if I sent that to somebody that wasn't familiar with that genre or that era, I don't think they would guess that's really a hardcore record. But then again, I think people think of this as sort of emo.
Yeah, I think like historically, it would end up being like, no, that cover totally makes sense. They were like that big emo band, right? And you'd be like, well, no. So one last thing I want to add about this record is that in revisiting it, I had this listed on Discogs and then pulled it because I was like, I'm not getting rid of this record.
Yeah, don't sell it. I wish I had mine with me.
I learned to reappreciate it. I try to get rid of everything. So to me, it's like a pretty high compliment when a record gets like, you know what?
Do you still have the Firestorm 7-inch?
I do. And I don't think it's in the sell pile.
I'm bummed on that because, I realize now that I sell more records than I buy, I realize I was never quite a collector. I just like a music lover. And my Earth Crisis Firestorm, I bought it on CD for I think it was the only like version I could find and I wanted it. It looks like a promo CD and it's probably scratched to hell because it's gone in and out of that case like 1,000 times.
Abilene, Detroit Locker, remastered.
We'll return after these messages.
Dear audience, this is the Abilene ND Burial box set. It includes Abilene's first LP, second LP, both remastered on vinyl for the first time, and a bonus LP of demos, unreleased songs with Doug McCombs of Tortoise on bass, and 2 extremely rare compilation tracks. Abilene was Alex Dunham from Hoover and Regulator Watts on guitar and vocals, Craig Ackerman of Luster King and later of Bloodiest on bass, and Scott Adamson of Chisel Drillhammer and Justifier on drums, and Fred Erskine of Hoover, June of 44, Crown Hate Ruin, The Boom, The Sorts, Him, and Justifier on trumpet. Comes with a 24-page screen-printed booklet that includes an oral history of the band. And so here is record number 1. Beautiful gatefold sleeve with the lyrics.
Wow.
This, when it came out, the lyrics were not included.
Was that issued on vinyl before?
No, just on CD by Slow Dime. And then we've got Two Guns, Twin Arrows, the second record, the Insane record.
That's amazing.
There's 2 colorways of vinyl, and then this is the bonus record. It's on Landland Cold Portage. You can get a download on Bandcamp, or you can stream it on Spotify.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
Thank you for watching. And if you like this podcast, please follow it on Spotify or subscribe on YouTube or Rumble or wherever it is that you're watching this thing. Is there anything else? Like, follow, subscribe, guys.
Like, follow, subscribe. Yeah, you got to say guys.
Hey, guys.
Hey, guys.